The morning fog hung thick over London as Sergeant William Drake stood at his post outside Buckingham Palace. His red uniform was pressed to perfection, his black bearskin hat adding nearly a foot to his already impressive height. After 12 years in the Queen's Guard, William had seen thousands of tourists snap photos, heard countless jokes about whether he could smile, and weathered every kind of weather the British climate could throw at him. But nothing in his training had prepared him for what was about to happen on that cold November morning. The day started like any other. Tourists gathered behind the iron gates, cameras ready to capture the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Children pointed excitedly while their parents explained the history and tradition. William remained perfectly still, eyes fixed forward, his face an emotionless mask. It was his job, his duty, and he took pride in it. His rifle rested against his shoulder, more ceremonial than practical, though he knew how to use it if needed. Around 9:30, William noticed something odd. A man in a dark coat stood apart from the crowd, not taking pictures or chatting with others. He simply stared at the palace gates with an intensity that made William's instincts tingle. The man was tall and thin, with pale skin and dark hair that hung slightly over his eyes. His coat seemed too heavy for the weather, bulky in a way that didn't quite fit his frame. William made a mental note but continued his duty, trusting that the security cameras and plainclothes officers scattered throughout the area were also watching. The man remained there for nearly 20 minutes, barely moving. Other tourists came and went, snapping their selfies and hurrying off to their next destination. But this man stayed. His hands were buried deep in his coat pockets and his eyes never left the palace entrance. William felt his pulse quicken slightly. Something wasn't right. He had learned to trust his gut over the years, and right now his gut was screaming at him. Then, without warning, the man began walking toward the gate, not quickly, not running, but with deliberate, measured steps. The crowd parted around him, sensing something off about his demeanor. William's training kicked in immediately. His muscles tensed beneath his uniform, ready to respond if needed. The other guards nearby also noticed, their postures shifting ever so slightly in ways only another soldier would recognize. The man reached the gate and stopped just inches from the iron bars. He pulled his right hand from his pocket and William's heart nearly stopped. The man was holding a gun, not pointing it, not threatening with it, just holding it loosely at his side as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Parents grabbed their children and backed away. Someone screamed. William's training took over completely. In one smooth motion, he brought his rifle to ready position and shouted the standard warning. His voice was steady and commanding, cutting through the panic of the crowd. The other guards moved into formation, creating a defensive line. Police officers who had been mingling with tourists suddenly revealed themselves, rushing toward the scene with their own weapons drawn. But the man didn't raise his gun. He didn't threaten anyone. He simply looked at William with the saddest eyes the sergeant had ever seen. They were eyes filled with pain, loss, and something else William couldn't quite identify. Desperation, perhaps, or resignation. The man's lips moved, forming words that William couldn't hear over the commotion. The crowd was being evacuated now, officers shouting orders, the entire area transforming from a tourist attraction into a potential crime scene in mere seconds. William kept his rifle trained on the man, his finger near the trigger, but not on it. He had clear rules of engagement, and the man wasn't actively threatening anyone. Not yet. The standoff felt like it lasted hours, though William knew it had been less than a minute. Backup was arriving from all directions. The palace was going into lockdown. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. The man took one step closer to the gate, then another. William shouted another warning, more forceful this time. The man stopped. He raised his left hand slowly, palm out in a gesture that seemed almost pleading. His mouth moved again, and this time William could make out some words. "Help me." That's what the man was saying, over and over. "Help me." Armed response units arrived, taking positions around the perimeter. A negotiator was being called. The entire street was being sealed off. William could see his commanding officer barking orders into a radio, coordinating the response. Helicopters thudded overhead. Media vans were already setting up down the block, cameras zooming in on the scene. But the man seemed oblivious to it all. He stared only at William, his sad eyes locked onto the sergeant's face. The gun hung loosely in his right hand, pointing at the ground. William's mind raced. Was this a suicide attempt? A protest? Mental illness? Terrorism? Nothing about the man's behavior fit any profile William had been taught. The man wasn't angry or aggressive. He wasn't making demands or shouting slogans. He was just standing there looking lost and broken, with a gun in his hand and the entire British police force surrounding him. William noticed something else then. The man's coat was moving slightly, as if something beneath it was shifting. His mind immediately went to explosives. Suicide vest. The thought made his blood run cold. He opened his mouth to warn the others, to call for everyone to fall back. But before he could speak, something impossible happened. The fog that had been slowly lifting all morning suddenly rushed back in, thick and heavy, rolling across the ground like a living thing. Within seconds, visibility dropped to almost nothing. William couldn't see more than a few feet in front of him. He could hear shouting, confusion, officers trying to maintain their positions. The command came through his earpiece to hold steady, not to lose visual contact with the suspect. But when the fog cleared moments later, the man was gone. William blinked hard, not trusting his own eyes. One moment the man had been standing right there, less than 10 feet away, and the next he had simply vanished. The iron gate was empty. The sidewalk beyond showed no signs of anyone fleeing. It was as if the man had evaporated into thin air, taking his gun and his sad eyes with him. Chaos erupted around William. Officers shouted conflicting reports into their radios. Some claimed the suspect had run east. Others swore they saw him heading west. A few insisted he must have gone north toward the palace gardens. But William knew better. He had kept his eyes locked on that exact spot the entire time. Even through the fog, even when visibility was at its worst, he had maintained focus on where the man had been standing. Nobody could have moved that fast without him seeing something. The commanding officer, Major Collins, stormed over to William's position. His face was red with frustration and confusion. He demanded to know what happened, where the suspect went, how he escaped. William gave his report as clearly as he could, but he knew how it sounded. A man with a gun simply vanished during a momentary fog bank. It was impossible. It defied logic. Yet that was exactly what had happened. Within minutes, the entire area was swarming with investigators. Police dogs were brought in to track the suspect's scent. They led their handlers right up to the spot where the man had been standing, and then circled in confusion, unable to pick up a trail leading away. The dogs acted strangely, whining and backing away from the gate as if something about that spot disturbed them. Security footage was pulled from every camera within a mile radius. Witnesses were interviewed one by one, their statements taken in painstaking detail. But none of it made sense. The security cameras showed the man approaching the gate, showed him standing there with the gun, showed the fog rolling in. But when the fog cleared, the cameras revealed exactly what William had seen with his own eyes. The man was simply gone. No running figure, no car speeding away, no accomplices helping him escape. One frame he was there, the next he wasn't. The technology experts insisted the footage hadn't been tampered with. The timestamp was continuous. There were no missing seconds or corrupted data. Witness statements were equally baffling. Most of the tourists had been too panicked to notice details, but those who had been paying close attention all told the same story. The man was there, then the fog came, then he wasn't. A few people mentioned feeling strange when the fog rolled in. One woman said the temperature dropped suddenly, like stepping into a freezer. An elderly man claimed he felt dizzy and disoriented for a few seconds. A teenager swore he heard a sound like rushing wind, though the air had been perfectly still. William was taken off duty and brought in for extensive questioning. He sat in an interview room for hours, going over every detail again and again. Intelligence services got involved, concerned this might be some new kind of terrorist tactic they hadn't encountered before. Could it be a sophisticated distraction for a larger plot? Was there some new technology that allowed people to disappear? Had the man actually been there at all? Or was this some kind of mass hallucination? The questions became more pointed. Had William been feeling ill that morning? Had he taken any medication? Was he under any unusual stress? The implication was clear, though nobody said it directly. They were wondering if he had imagined the whole thing or if his memory was faulty. But William knew what he had seen. He had been standing 3 meters away from that man. He had looked into those sad, desperate eyes. He had heard the plea for help. It had all been terrifyingly real. As the day wore on, more strange details emerged. The gun the man had been holding was never found. No shell casings, no weapon discarded nearby, nothing. Officers searched every trash can, every bush, every possible hiding place within running distance. They checked rooftops and underground tunnels. They interviewed homeless people who lived in the area, asking if anyone had seen a man in a dark coat. Nothing. It was as if the man and his weapon had been erased from existence. One of the investigating detectives, a woman named Inspector Sarah Mitchell, seemed particularly interested in the man's appearance. She showed William hundreds of photos, asking if any of them matched the suspect. Criminal databases, missing persons, known terrorists, political activists. William studied each face carefully, but none of them were right. The man's features were starting to blur in his memory, which frustrated him. He had looked right at the man, but now when he tried to describe him in detail, the specifics slipped away like water through his fingers. Inspector Mitchell noticed his frustration. She explained that it was normal after a traumatic event for memories to become less reliable, the brain's way of protecting itself. But William insisted this was different. It wasn't that he couldn't remember. It was more like the memory itself was fading, as if it were being erased somehow. The man's face, which had been so clear in those tense moments, was now foggy and indistinct in his mind. Even the color of his eyes, which William had been certain about just hours ago, now seemed uncertain. By evening, William was finally allowed to go home. His wife Emma had been calling constantly, worried sick after seeing the news reports. He found her waiting in their small flat near Victoria Station, her face pale with concern. She threw her arms around him the moment he walked through the door, holding him tight as if he might vanish too. William tried to explain what had happened, but even to his own ears the story sounded insane. Emma listened quietly, not interrupting, her hand holding his throughout. When he finished, she didn't question whether he was telling the truth or suggest he might have been mistaken. She simply asked if he was all right. William realized he didn't know how to answer that. Physically, he was fine, but mentally, the experience had shaken something loose inside him. He had spent his entire adult life in service, trained for every possible scenario, prepared for danger and crisis. But he had never been prepared for something impossible. That night, William couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those sad eyes staring at him. He heard the whispered plea for help. He felt the strange chill that had accompanied the fog. Around 3 a.m, he gave up trying to rest and went to his laptop. He started searching online for similar incidents. Reports of people vanishing, unexplained disappearances, strange fog banks. Most of what he found was nonsense, conspiracy theories, and ghost stories. But buried among the fiction, he found something interesting. There were other reports. Not many and scattered across years, but they existed. A man in Paris who had approached the Eiffel Tower with a knife and then vanished when police surrounded him. A woman in New York who had stood on a bridge threatening to jump, only to disappear when officers tried to talk her down. Each incident involved someone in distress, someone who seemed to be asking for help, and each ended with an impossible vanishing act. The details varied, but the pattern was there if you knew to look for it. William took notes, copying down dates and locations. He found himself falling down a research rabbit hole, clicking from one obscure article to another. Some of the stories were obviously fake or exaggerated, but others had official police reports attached. Witness statements. Investigations that led nowhere. Always the same conclusion. No evidence of how the person had escaped. Just gone as if they had never existed at all. William wondered if other officers had sat in their homes at night just like this, searching for answers, trying to make sense of the impossible thing they had witnessed. The next morning, William was called back to headquarters for another round of interviews. This time, the atmosphere was different. The questions were less about what he had seen and more about his mental state. A police psychologist was brought in to evaluate him. The implication was becoming clearer. Without any evidence of how the man had escaped, without any trace of the gun or the suspect, the official narrative was shifting. Maybe nothing had really happened. Maybe the stress of the job had gotten to William. Maybe the whole incident was being blown out of proportion. William felt anger rising in his chest, but he pushed it down. Getting emotional wouldn't help. He calmly repeated his statement, emphasizing that dozens of other people had seen the man too. The cameras had recorded him. This wasn't a hallucination or a mental break. but he could see the doubt in their eyes. An impossible event was easier to dismiss than to investigate. Easier to blame on unreliable witnesses than to admit they had no explanation. Inspector Mitchell pulled him aside after the formal interview. She spoke in a low voice, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. She told William that she believed him. She had read the other reports he had probably found online by now. She had been investigating similar cases for 3 years, quietly on her own time. The department thought she was wasting resources chasing shadows, but she knew something real was happening, something they didn't understand. She handed William a folder containing copies of case files. Incidents from around the world spanning decades. Each one involved a person in crisis who had vanished under impossible circumstances. Mitchell had identified 47 cases that fit the pattern, though she suspected there were many more that had never been properly documented or had been deliberately covered up. Government agencies didn't like admitting when they encountered something beyond their understanding. William studied the files over the next few days. He was placed on administrative leave pending a full psychological evaluation, which gave him time to dig deeper. The cases Mitchell had collected were remarkably consistent. The vanishing person was always alone. They always appeared to be in some kind of distress or crisis. They often tried to communicate something, though witnesses rarely understood what they were trying to say. And they always disappeared during a moment when visibility was obscured, usually by fog or sudden darkness or some other environmental factor. One case from Tokyo particularly caught William's attention. A businessman had stood on the roof of an office building preparing to jump. Police and negotiators had surrounded the building. The man had been shouting something about needing to go back, that he didn't belong here. Then, during a sudden rainstorm that reduced visibility, he had vanished from the roof. Security footage showed him there one moment and gone the next. No body was ever found on the ground below. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist. William contacted the Tokyo police detective who had worked that case. With Mitchell's help and some translation software, he managed to communicate with Detective Tanaka. The conversation was awkward and difficult, but Tanaka remembered the incident clearly. It had haunted him for years. He had been certain the man was going to jump, had been preparing himself for the tragedy, and then nothing. The man had simply vanished. Tanaka had checked hospital records, morgues, missing persons reports. He had never found any trace of the businessman again. What struck William most was what Tanaka said about the man's eyes. Even through the language barrier, through the imperfect translation, the description matched perfectly. Sad eyes, desperate eyes, eyes that seemed to be looking at something far away, eyes that were pleading for help, though not the kind of help anyone present could provide. Tanaka had been standing on that roof, had been within arm's reach of the man when he disappeared. He knew what he had seen, and like William, he had been dismissed and doubted by his own department. William began making more connections. He found a retired police officer in Germany who had witnessed a similar event in Berlin. A young woman standing on the Oberbaum Bridge, holding what appeared to be a knife, though later investigation couldn't determine if it had been real or just something that looked like a weapon. She had been shouting in a language nobody recognized. Then she had stepped behind one of the bridge's support pillars and never emerged on the other side. Officers had rushed to the spot immediately. The woman was simply gone. The German officer, now in his 70s, had kept his own files on the incident. He sent William everything he had, along with a note saying he was relieved to finally talk to someone else who understood. He had spent years questioning his own sanity, wondering if age or stress had made him unreliable, but he knew what he had seen. The woman had been real. Her disappearance had been impossible, but it had happened. A pattern was emerging from all these cases, something William couldn't quite put his finger on but felt was important. The people who vanished were always armed or appeared to be armed, though the weapons were never found afterward. They always tried to communicate something urgent, and they always seemed confused or disoriented, as if they didn't quite understand where they were or how they had gotten there. It reminded William of how people with dementia sometimes got lost in familiar places, knowing something was wrong but unable to articulate what. Emma grew increasingly worried about William's obsession with the case. He barely slept, spent every waking hour reading files and making connections. She understood that he needed answers, that the experience had shaken his fundamental understanding of reality, but she was concerned about his health, both physical and mental. She tried to get him to take breaks, to spend time doing normal things, but William couldn't let it go. He felt like he was on the edge of understanding something important. One evening, while going through the files for the 100th time, William noticed something new. In several of the cases, witnesses had reported feeling strange physical sensations just before the disappearance. Dizziness, nausea, a sense of vertigo or disorientation. One witness in the Berlin case had described it as feeling like the world had tilted slightly, as if gravity had shifted direction for a moment. Another from a case in Melbourne said it felt like being on a boat during rough seas, even though they were standing on solid ground. William remembered the tourist who had mentioned feeling dizzy during the fog. He tracked her down through police records and called her. The woman, a schoolteacher from Manchester, was surprised to hear from him but willing to talk. She described the sensation in more detail. It had been like the ground was moving beneath her feet, she said. Like reality itself had become unstable for just a moment. She had assumed it was panic or fear. But thinking back, it had happened before she realized anything was wrong. Before she had even registered that the man had a gun. This was significant. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just affecting the person who vanished. It was affecting the environment around them. The fog, the dizziness, the strange sensations, these weren't coincidences or side effects. They were part of the phenomenon itself. William felt like he was finally starting to understand the shape of the puzzle, even if he couldn't yet see the full picture. Inspector Mitchell called him late one night. She had been reviewing old case files in the archives and had found something, a report from 1952, buried in a filing cabinet that was scheduled to be destroyed. A soldier had vanished from his post at the Tower of London under nearly identical circumstances. Armed, distressed, disappeared during a fog bank. But this report had an addendum that the others didn't. A witness statement from a local doctor who had been walking nearby. The doctor had written a detailed account of what he had observed. He described seeing the soldier standing at his post, then watching as the air around the man seemed to shimmer and distort, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. The soldier had reached out as if trying to grab onto something invisible. Then the fog had rolled in, and when it cleared, both the soldier and the strange shimmering effect were gone. The doctor had been questioned extensively and eventually dismissed as an unreliable witness. But his statement had been kept in the file, perhaps by someone who believed him. William drove to meet Inspector Mitchell at a quiet cafe far from any police station. They spread the old files across the table, comparing the 1952 report to the modern cases. The similarities were unmistakable. Even the description of the shimmering air matched something William had noticed but not consciously registered. In those last moments before the fog rolled in, the air around the man had seemed to ripple slightly, like looking through warped glass. Mitchell had brought more than just old files. She had been in contact with a professor at Cambridge University, a physicist named Dr. Eleanor Vance who specialized in theoretical research. Mitchell had been reluctant to involve academics, worried about being laughed at or dismissed. But Dr. Vance had a reputation for taking unconventional ideas seriously and had published papers on phenomena that most scientists refused to even consider. They met with Dr. Vance 2 days later at her cluttered office overlooking the university grounds. She was younger than William had expected, probably in her early 40s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She listened to their account without interrupting, occasionally making notes. When they finished, she sat back and was quiet for a long moment, her fingers steepled under her chin. What they were describing, Dr. Vance finally said, sounded like a space-time anomaly. Not time travel exactly, but something related. She explained that according to current physics, space-time wasn't as stable as people thought. Under certain conditions, it could bend, warp, or even tear. These events would be incredibly rare and poorly understood, but they were theoretically possible. The shimmering effect witnesses described could be light bending around a point where space-time was becoming unstable. William felt a chill run down his spine. This was starting to sound less like a mystery to be solved and more like something out of science fiction. But Dr. Vance assured him that strange didn't mean impossible. The universe was full of phenomena that seemed impossible until they were properly understood. Black holes had once been considered absurd. Quantum entanglement had seemed like magic. Reality was stranger than most people realized. The question was why these anomalies would be attracted to people in crisis. Dr. Vance had a theory about that too. Human consciousness, she explained. generated measurable electromagnetic fields. Strong emotions like fear, desperation, or suicidal thoughts produced particularly intense field variations. It was possible, though highly speculative, that these emotional states could somehow interact with or even trigger space-time instabilities in people who were already predisposed to them for unknown reasons. Mitchell asked the obvious question. Where were these people going when they vanished? Dr. Vance hesitated before answering. She said there were several possibilities. They could be moving through time, displaced to the past or future. They could be shifting to a parallel reality or dimension, or, and she said this gently, they could simply be ceasing to exist, torn apart by forces beyond their control. Without more data, there was no way to know. William thought about the man's desperate eyes, the plea for help. If Dr. Vance was right, that man might have been caught in something beyond his control, pulled through time or space against his will. The gun might have been for self-defense in whatever situation he had come from. The confusion and disorientation made sense if he had been suddenly displaced from his normal reality into theirs. He hadn't been trying to threaten anyone. He had been terrified and lost, reaching out for help in the only way he could. Over the next few weeks, William, Mitchell, and Dr. Vance formed an unlikely research team. They compiled every case they could find, looking for additional patterns. They discovered that the disappearances clustered around certain geographic locations. London had more incidents than anywhere else in the UK. Tokyo had a high concentration in Japan. Berlin, New York, Paris, all major cities, all with long histories and dense populations. Dr. Vance suggested that perhaps these locations had some property that made space-time more unstable there. They also found that incidents seemed to increase during certain times of year. Solar storms and geomagnetic disturbances correlated with higher rates of disappearances. This supported Dr. Vance's theory about electromagnetic fields playing a role. The Earth's magnetic field wasn't constant. It fluctuated based on solar activity. During periods of high activity, the field became more chaotic, and that chaos might facilitate these anomalous events. William's psychological evaluation came back, and to his relief, he was cleared for duty. The therapist noted that he had experienced a traumatic event and might benefit from counseling, but found no evidence of mental illness or impairment. He was allowed to return to his post at Buckingham Palace, though he knew his career had been permanently affected by the incident. His fellow guards looked at him differently now, some with sympathy, others with suspicion. He had become the man who lost a suspect in impossible circumstances. On his first day back, William felt nervous approaching the palace gates. The spot where the man had vanished looked exactly as it always had. Tourists milled about, taking photos and chatting. The changing of the guard proceeded with its usual precision. Everything was normal, except William knew it wasn't. Reality wasn't as solid as it appeared. Under the surface of everyday life lurked forces that could snatch people away in an instant. He found himself scanning the crowds more carefully now, looking for that particular kind of desperate energy that preceded the anomalies. He wondered how many times these events had happened without anyone noticing. How many missing persons reports were actually people who had been pulled through time or space? How many cold cases could be explained by phenomena that science barely understood? Mitchell kept him updated on new cases as they occurred. There was one in Moscow, another in Cairo. The pattern continued. Always someone in distress, always an impossible vanishing. They were building a database, trying to gather enough information to predict when and where the next event might occur. Dr. Vance thought that if they could study an incident as it happened, with proper equipment, they might finally understand what was really going on. But getting official support for such research proved impossible. Mitchell's superiors had already told her to drop the investigation. Dr. Vance couldn't get funding for something so speculative and strange. They were on their own, 3 people trying to understand a phenomenon that the rest of the world either didn't believe in or preferred to ignore. It was frustrating and isolating, but they pressed on. The truth mattered even if nobody else wanted to hear it. Emma remained supportive but worried. She saw how the investigation consumed William, how he couldn't let it go. She understood why it was important to him, but she also saw the toll it was taking. He had nightmares about those sad eyes. He jumped at sudden noises. He had become hypervigilant, always watching for signs of the impossible. She did her best to keep him grounded, to remind him of normal life, but she could see him slipping further into obsession. One night, William had a dream that felt different from the others. He was standing at his post again, but the palace looked wrong somehow. The stones were older, weathered differently. The crowds wore strange clothes, styles from another era. He looked down and saw that his uniform was different too, an older version from decades past. Then he saw the man from that day standing at the gate, looking at him with those same sad eyes. In the dream, William understood something he hadn't before. The man wasn't asking for help getting away from something. He was asking for help getting back to wherever he had come from, whenever that was. He was lost in time or space, displaced from his reality, desperately trying to find his way home. And the gun hadn't been for protection. It was an anchor, something from his original time and place, something he was holding on to because it was real and familiar in a world that had become strange and incomprehensible. William woke with a start, his heart pounding. The dream had felt significant, like his subconscious had been working on the puzzle and had finally made a connection. He wrote down everything he could remember, then sent a message to Mitchell and Dr. Vance. If he was right, if these people were displaced rather than choosing to vanish, then the disappearances weren't random. They were people trying to get home or being pulled home by whatever force had displaced them in the first place. Dr. Vance found the theory compelling. She said it aligned with certain ideas about how space-time anomalies might work. If someone fell through a tear in space-time, they would naturally try to find their way back. The emotional distress would be intense, which would generate those strong electromagnetic fields. Those fields might then interact with the original anomaly, creating a feedback loop that eventually pulled the person back through. It wasn't a conscious choice. It was more like water flowing downhill, following the path of least resistance back to its source. The breakthrough came 3 months after the original incident. Dr. Vance had been working with data from gravitational wave detectors, massive scientific instruments designed to detect ripples in space-time. She noticed something odd. At the exact moment of several documented disappearances, the detectors had registered tiny anomalies. They were dismissed as noise or equipment glitches at the time, but when she matched them against Mitchell's database of incidents, the correlation was undeniable. The disappearances were creating measurable distortions in space-time. This was the evidence they needed. Dr. Vance published a paper outlining her findings, carefully worded to avoid sounding too sensational. She presented it as an exploration of unusual space-time phenomena that might correlate with unexplained disappearances. The scientific community's response was skeptical but not entirely dismissive. A few other researchers reached out, intrigued by the data even if they doubted the conclusions. Meanwhile, William continued his duty at the palace, but his perspective had fundamentally changed. He no longer saw his role as just ceremonial. He was a witness to something profound, someone who had looked directly at the thin membrane between realities and seen it tear. That experience had marked him in ways he was still trying to understand. He felt a responsibility to the man who had vanished, to help tell his story even if he would never know who the man was or where he had come from. Mitchell had been following up on another angle. She had been reviewing missing persons reports from around London, looking for anyone who might match the description of the man at the palace. Most cases didn't fit, but one caught her attention. A report filed in 1967 about a young man who had disappeared after leaving his flat one morning. The physical description was vague, but the circumstances were interesting. The missing man had been a military veteran, recently discharged, and several neighbors reported he had seemed confused and disoriented in the days before he vanished. The case had never been solved. The man had simply walked out of his life and never been seen again. No body was found. No evidence of foul play. He had left behind everything, including his wallet and identification. At the time, it was assumed he had suffered some kind of mental break, perhaps related to his military service, and had started a new life somewhere else. But now Mitchell wondered if something else had happened to him. She tracked down the missing man's surviving relatives, a nephew who was now in his 60s. He remembered his uncle vaguely, more from family stories than personal memory. The uncle had been a quiet man, troubled by his time in the service, though he never talked about what he had experienced. In his last few weeks, he had told family members strange things. He said time felt wrong, that sometimes he felt like he was in 2 places at once. He complained about seeing things that nobody else could see, hearing sounds that weren't there. The family had assumed these were symptoms of shell shock or what would now be called PTSD. But what if it had been something else? What if the man had already been experiencing the early effects of space-time displacement? William thought about the man at the gate, how confused he had seemed, how he had been reaching out for help. Maybe he had been that missing soldier from 1967, somehow pulled forward through time to 2025, displaced by 58 years and utterly lost in a world he didn't recognize. The theory was impossible to prove, but it fit. It explained why the man had seemed so disoriented, why he had carried a gun that looked like it was from an earlier era, even though William hadn't consciously noticed that detail at the time. It explained the desperate plea for help. The man wasn't a criminal or a terrorist. He was a victim, caught in forces beyond anyone's control, briefly appearing in the wrong time before being pulled back to wherever he belonged. Dr. Vance was fascinated by this possibility. If space-time anomalies could displace people through time, it meant the phenomenon was far more complex than they had initially thought. She began developing mathematical models to explain how such displacement might occur. The equations were dense and difficult, involving concepts from quantum mechanics and general relativity that William couldn't fully grasp. But the basic idea was that under certain conditions, a person could become unstuck in time, sliding forward or backward through the decades like a stone skipping across water. The implications were staggering. Every missing person throughout history might not have run away or met with foul play. Some percentage of them, however small, might have been displaced through time. They could be wandering through different eras, confused and desperate, trying to find their way home to a time that no longer existed in their present. It was a horrifying thought. Imagine being ripped from everything you knew and dropped into a world decades removed, where everyone you loved was gone or didn't yet exist. William thought about this often during his long shifts at the palace. He would stand at his post watching tourists stream past and wonder if any of them were displaced persons who had learned to adapt. Maybe some people who vanished didn't immediately return to their original time. Maybe they got stuck, forced to build new lives in unfamiliar eras. They would seem odd to those around them, out of touch with current events, confused by technology or social customs. But they would survive because humans were adaptable. Mitchell brought new information that supported this theory. She had found several historical accounts of people who had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, with no memory of how they had arrived at their location. One case from 1891 involved a woman who had been found wandering the streets of London, wearing clothes that seemed decades out of date, speaking English with an accent that didn't match any known regional dialect. She had been unable to explain where she came from or how she got there. Eventually, she was placed in an asylum, where she spent the rest of her life insisting she was from the future. Another case from 1923 involved a man who had walked into a police station claiming to be from 1875. He had detailed knowledge of events from that era but seemed genuinely shocked by automobiles and electric lights. He was dismissed as delusional, but hospital records showed he had scars from injuries consistent with 19th century surgical techniques that were no longer used by the 1920s. He disappeared from the hospital 3 weeks later, vanishing from a locked room with no explanation. These cases and others like them suggested that displacement could go in both directions. People could be pulled forward or pushed backward through time. The connecting factor seemed to be emotional distress and proximity to certain locations. Perhaps there were weak points in space-time, places where the barrier between different times was thinner than normal. Buckingham Palace might be one such location, which would explain why William had witnessed the incident there. Dr. Vance began mapping these potential weak points using the historical data. She found clusters of disappearances and strange appearances around certain buildings and landmarks, especially ones with long histories and significant emotional weight. Places where major historical events had occurred, where strong emotions had been repeatedly experienced over centuries, seemed to show higher rates of anomalous activity. It was as if human consciousness, repeated over time, could actually wear thin the fabric of space-time. The research was progressing, but they were running into practical limitations. They needed more funding, more equipment, more official support. Dr. Vance's department at Cambridge was growing concerned about her focus on what they considered fringe science. Mitchell was being pressured by her superiors to focus on conventional cases. William was just a guard with no research credentials or authority. They were three people trying to understand something that might require the resources of entire governments to properly investigate. Then something happened that changed everything. Another incident occurred in London, this time at Westminster Abbey. A young woman had appeared suddenly during a tourist tour, stumbling out of thin air in front of dozens of witnesses. She was dressed in Victorian-era clothing and was clutching an old photograph. Before security could reach her, she had collapsed. When paramedics arrived, she was unconscious but alive. She was taken to hospital where she remained in a coma-like state. Mitchell called William immediately. This was different from previous cases. The person hadn't vanished. She had appeared instead, and she was still here, physical and real and available to examine. For the first time, they had a chance to study someone who had been displaced. Dr. Vance rushed to the hospital with her equipment. William took emergency leave and joined them. This was the opportunity they had been waiting for. The woman's condition was baffling to doctors. All her vital signs were normal, but she wouldn't wake up. Brain scans showed unusual activity patterns, but nothing that indicated injury or illness. It was as if her mind was somewhere else, disconnected from her body. Dr. Vance set up her instruments around the bed, measuring electromagnetic fields and looking for any signs of space-time distortion. The readings were remarkable. The air around the woman was producing faint but measurable warping effects, similar to what had been detected during the disappearance incidents. Over the next several days, the research team worked around the clock. They documented everything, measured everything, analyzed every piece of data they could collect. The photograph. William listened to Catherine's story with a mixture of amazement and sadness. She spoke of her life in Victorian London, of the family she had left behind, of the work she had been doing that morning. She clutched the photograph desperately, explaining that it showed her parents and siblings. She had been carrying it because her mother had been ill, and Catherine had been praying for her recovery at the Abbey. Now she was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't understand, surrounded by impossibilities. Dr. Vance tried to explain what had happened in terms Catherine might grasp. But how do you explain space-time displacement to someone from the 1880s? The concepts didn't exist yet in Catherine's world. There was no framework for understanding that she had been pulled forward through time by over a century. Catherine listened with wide, frightened eyes, clearly thinking the people around her were mad or that she herself had lost her mind. The situation presented enormous ethical and practical challenges. What were they supposed to do with Catherine? She couldn't return to her own time, at least not with any method they understood. She had no identity in the modern world, no documentation, no way to prove who she was or where she came from. She was legally speaking a person who didn't exist, and psychologically she was traumatized beyond anything their experience could address. How do you treat someone whose entire world has been ripped away? Mitchell worked on the practical matters, quietly arranging temporary accommodation and trying to figure out how to create a legal identity for someone from another century. It required calling in favors and bending rules, but she managed to get Catherine a place to stay and basic documentation under the guise of her being a foreign national with lost papers. It wasn't perfect, but it would work temporarily while they figured out what to do long-term. William found himself drawn to helping Catherine adjust. Perhaps it was because he had witnessed the other side of this phenomenon, had seen someone displaced trying to get home. He felt responsible somehow, as if his experience with the man at the palace had connected him to everyone else who suffered from these temporal displacements. He spent hours with Catherine, gently introducing her to the modern world in small doses, trying to make the impossible adjustment less overwhelming. Catherine was remarkably resilient. After the initial shock wore off, she began asking questions, wanting to understand this strange future she found herself in. William showed her photographs from different eras, helping her see how the world had changed gradually from her time to his. He explained wars and technological advances, social changes and political shifts. Catherine absorbed it all with a sharp intelligence that impressed him. She wept when she learned that everyone she had known was long dead, but she didn't fall apart. She grieved and then continued learning, adapting, surviving. Dr. Vance continued studying Catherine with her permission, running tests and monitoring the space-time distortions that still flickered weakly around her. The readings were slowly diminishing, as if Catherine was gradually becoming anchored to this time period. Dr. Vance theorized that displacement might have a settling period, during which the person could theoretically be pulled back to their original time. But as days passed and they became more integrated into their new present, that possibility faded. Catherine was becoming permanently stuck in 2025. The discovery of Catherine and the data they collected from her case finally gave them credibility. Dr. Vance was able to secure funding for a formal research project. Other scientists began taking the phenomenon seriously. The evidence was too strong to ignore now. They had a living, breathing person from the Victorian era, with genetic and historical evidence supporting her claims. The scientific community couldn't dismiss this as delusion or fraud. William's role in the discovery brought him recognition he didn't particularly want. He was interviewed by researchers, asked to testify about what he had witnessed at Buckingham Palace. His account was now taken seriously rather than doubted, but he found no satisfaction in being vindicated. He kept thinking about the man with the gun who had appeared so briefly before vanishing. Had that man made it home? Was he lost somewhere in time? There was no way to know. Mitchell's database of cases took on new significance. Each entry represented a real person, someone who had been ripped from their proper time and place. Some had vanished, presumably returning home or perhaps being displaced to yet another era. Others, like Catherine, had appeared and stayed, forced to adapt or perish. Mitchell estimated there might be dozens of displaced people currently living in various time periods, trying to survive in eras not their own, likely dismissed as mentally ill or fraudulent if they tried to explain their situation. The research expanded rapidly. Teams were formed to study space-time anomalies, to map the locations where displacement seemed most likely to occur, to develop theories about what caused the phenomenon and whether it could be predicted or controlled. William was offered a position as a consultant, his first-hand experience valuable to researchers trying to understand the human side of displacement. He accepted, taking a leave from his military duties to help with something he now understood was far more important than ceremonial guard work. Catherine became the center of the research project, but she was treated as a person, not just a subject. She attended therapy to help process her trauma. She learned to read and write in modern English, which was different enough from her Victorian education to require adjustment. She learned to use computers and phones, though the technology often overwhelmed her. William helped her navigate it all, becoming her friend and advocate in a world that was strange and often unkind. One day, several months after her arrival, Catherine asked William about the man he had seen at the palace. He told her the whole story, including his theory that the man had been displaced from the 1960s. Catherine listened thoughtfully, then said something that struck William deeply. She said the man had been lucky. He had been pulled back home, or at least away from a time that wasn't his. Catherine would never go home. She would never see her family again, never return to the world she knew. She was marooned in the future, and she had to find a way to live with that. William realized she was right. As traumatic as his experience had been, watching someone vanish into impossibility, Catherine's experience was far worse. She was living the nightmare of displacement every day, and yet she faced it with courage and determination. She was learning, adapting, building a new life from nothing. It was extraordinary and heartbreaking at the same time. The research project identified several other possible cases of displaced people currently living in various parts of the world. People who had appeared mysteriously with no clear history or origin, who seemed out of place in subtle ways. Mitchell and her team began the delicate work of trying to contact them, to verify whether they were truly displaced or just people with unusual circumstances. Some were willing to talk. Others wanted nothing to do with investigations that might expose their secret. One case particularly interested William, a man in his 70s living in Scotland, who had appeared in Edinburgh in 1983, claiming to be from the 1940s. He had been dismissed as a fraud or mentally disturbed at the time, but he had persisted in his story. He had detailed knowledge of World War II that seemed too specific and personal to be researched. He had scars from injuries sustained in battles, with medical records showing treatments consistent with 1940s field medicine, and he had aged normally from 1983 to the present, suggesting he had become anchored to his new timeline. William traveled to Scotland to meet the man, whose name was Robert McAllister. Robert had built a quiet life in his displaced time, working as a history consultant and living alone. When William explained the research and introduced himself, Robert's reaction was one of relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. For 40 years, Robert had believed he was insane or cursed. Now someone was telling him it was real, that he wasn't alone, that others had experienced the same impossible thing. Robert's story was similar to Catherine's. He had been a soldier during the war, had felt dizzy and disoriented one day, and had suddenly found himself in 1983. The world had changed so much he had barely recognized it. He had tried to find his family, only to discover they were either dead or elderly strangers who didn't know him. His younger self, the version born and living normally through the timeline, existed as an old man completely unaware of his displaced older self. It was disorienting and philosophically troubling. Which Robert was real? Both? Neither? William collected Robert's story and brought it back to the research team. They now had 3 confirmed cases of displacement: Catherine, Robert, and the man at the palace who had vanished, plus dozens of other possible cases that were still being investigated. The phenomenon was rare but real, and it was ongoing. People were still being displaced, still appearing or vanishing in moments of space-time instability. 2 years after the incident at Buckingham Palace, William stood in a conference room at Cambridge University, looking at a wall covered in timelines and data points. The research had grown far beyond anything he had imagined that foggy November morning. Dr. Vance's team now included physicists, historians, psychologists, and investigators from around the world. They had documented over 200 cases of probable temporal displacement, spanning 5 centuries of history. The phenomenon was real, measurable, and more common than anyone had suspected. Catherine entered the room carrying coffee, dressed in modern clothes and moving with confidence through the contemporary world. She had adapted remarkably well, finding work as a historical consultant for museums and film productions. Her authentic knowledge of Victorian life was invaluable, and she had learned to frame her expertise without revealing its impossible source. She smiled at William, a sad but genuine smile that acknowledged both what she had lost and what she had gained. Inspector Mitchell had retired from the police force to work full-time on displacement research. She coordinated a global network of investigators tracking potential cases, helping displaced people adjust, and documenting patterns. The database she had started as a hobby had become a comprehensive archive that governments and scientific institutions now took seriously. She had finally found validation for years of dismissed work, though she often said the validation mattered less than helping the victims. Dr. Vance had just returned from a conference where she presented findings that were revolutionizing physics. The evidence for space-time instability was now undeniable. Her theories about weak points in temporal fabric were being tested and refined by researchers worldwide. She had won awards and recognition, but like Mitchell, she seemed more focused on the practical implications. Understanding the phenomenon was important. Helping those affected by it was essential. William's role had evolved from witness to advocate. He worked directly with displaced people, helping them navigate the psychological and practical challenges of living in the wrong time. His military background and the respect he had earned through his honesty about the palace incident gave him credibility with both the displaced and the institutions they dealt with. He had found his true calling, something far more meaningful than standing guard at ceremonial posts. The team had developed protocols for identifying likely displacement cases and providing support. They worked with therapists who specialized in severe trauma, with legal experts who could help create identities, with historians who could verify details from different eras. They had created a hidden network of displaced people who supported each other, sharing the burden of their impossible secret. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Nobody had to face displacement alone anymore. One morning, William received an urgent call. Another incident had occurred at Buckingham Palace. A woman had appeared at the gates during the changing of the guard, dressed in clothing from what looked like the future. She was disoriented, frightened, carrying some kind of device nobody recognized. The guards had secured the area, but remembering William's case, they had called him instead of treating it as a typical security threat. William rushed to the palace, his heart pounding. A woman from the future. That would be a first for their documented cases. Most displacements they had found were from the past into the present or near future. This woman claimed to be from 2089, 64 years ahead. If she was telling the truth, it meant displacement worked in both directions along the timeline more dramatically than they had proven. The woman, who identified herself as Dr. Yuki Tanaka, was being held in a secure room. William was allowed to see her after explaining his credentials and history with similar cases. She looked at him with relief when he entered, clearly grateful to find someone who wasn't treating her like a criminal or a lunatic. She spoke English with an accent that sounded familiar yet foreign, using words and phrases that didn't quite exist yet, but were understandable in context. Yuki's story tumbled out in a rush. She was a scientist in her own time, studying the very phenomenon that had now caught her. Temporal displacement had been documented more thoroughly in her era, was understood to be a natural if rare occurrence. She'd been studying a weak point near Buckingham Palace, trying to map its properties, when something went wrong. The instability had grabbed her and pulled her backward through time. She was stuck here, in what to her was the distant past, and she didn't know if she could get home. But Yuki brought something invaluable: knowledge. She had information about how temporal displacement worked, data from decades of future research, understanding that William's team was only beginning to develop. She explained that weak points in spacetime occurred naturally at locations with significant temporal density, places where many important events and strong emotions had accumulated over centuries. Buckingham Palace was one of the strongest weak points in the world, which explained why both William's original incident and Yuki's arrival had happened there. She also brought a warning. In her timeline, temporal displacement was increasing in frequency. The weak points were growing more unstable, possibly due to some large-scale process affecting spacetime itself that scientists didn't fully understand yet. More people were being displaced, causing social and philosophical problems that her society was still struggling to address. If the trend continued into the past, William's era would see increasing incidents as well. Dr. Vance was brought in to speak with Yuki, and the two scientists fell into deep conversation, using mathematical concepts that William could barely follow. Yuki's device, which looked like a sophisticated piece of technology far beyond current capabilities, was examined carefully. It contained data storage using principles that didn't exist yet, but that Vance thought she could understand with time. The information on it could advance their research by decades, if they could access it. Over the following weeks, Yuki integrated into the research team, bringing future knowledge that had to be carefully verified and adapted. Some of what she knew didn't apply yet, because the technological or theoretical foundations weren't in place. Other information was immediately useful, helping them refine their models and predictions. She was a gift from the future, though she would have given anything to return home. William watched Yuki adjust to the past just as he had watched Catherine adjust to the future. Both women were brilliant and strong, but both were also deeply lonely, cut off from everything they had known. He did what he could to help, knowing it would never be enough. You couldn't replace someone's entire world, couldn't give back the people and places they had lost. All you could do was stand beside them and help them build something new. The research continued, expanding and deepening. They developed warning systems for locations with strong temporal weak points, monitoring for the signs that preceded displacement events. They couldn't stop the displacements from happening, but they could be ready to help when they did. They could make sure displaced people weren't dismissed or institutionalized, that they received support and understanding. William sometimes thought about the man with the gun, wondered where he was, when he was. He hoped the man had made it home to his proper time, had found peace after his brief and terrifying appearance in 2025. That image of desperate eyes asking for help would stay with William forever. It had changed everything, had led him down a path he never could have imagined when he was just a ceremonial guard trying to stand perfectly still. One evening, William stood at his old post outside Buckingham Palace, no longer in uniform, but visiting the site where his journey had begun. Tourists walked past, taking their photos, unaware of the invisible weak point that existed just meters away. Unaware that reality was thinner here than they realized, that time itself could bend and tear and pull people through to where they didn't belong. Emma joined him, slipping her hand into his. She had supported him through everything, had been patient with his obsession, had eventually joined the research effort herself as an administrator, helping coordinate the growing network of support services. They stood together in silence, watching the guards perform their duty, thinking about all the invisible wounds and wonders that existed beneath the surface of normal life. William's phone buzzed with a message from Mitchell. Another possible case had been reported in Tokyo. A man claiming to be from the 1970s, with documentation that seemed authentic, asking for help. William would fly out tomorrow to investigate. This was his life now, not standing guard but helping the lost find their way, not protecting a palace but protecting people caught in the cracks between moments, displaced through time by forces beyond their control. The sun set over London, casting long shadows across the palace grounds. William squeezed Emma's hand and turned away from the gates. There was work to do, people to help, mysteries to unravel. The man with the gun had vanished without a trace, but his brief appearance had revealed a truth the world needed to understand. Reality was stranger and more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. And somewhere in the folds of time, people were falling through the cracks, crying out for help that finally, thanks to one impossible moment on a foggy morning, might actually come.